Well, thank you for coming to one of the last two panels of the conference. And thanks to the Climate Reserve and all its supporters for having us here today. I'm Carolyn Whetzel. I'm a reporter with Bloomberg BNA. And we're going to talk a little bit about new developments in offset markets. I'll let you look at the brochure for all the detailed bios of the panelists. But we basically have three Seans and a Rachel. So this is Sean Carney from Finite Carbon, Sean Newsum from Boeing Commercial Airplanes, and Sean Penrith from the Climate Trust, and Rachel Tornek from, I left off the C, from the Climate Action Reserve. So thank you all. I think basically what I'm going to do is start off with a few questions to each of our speakers and then leave time for your questions. And since we're in California, I'm going to start off with talking about the California market and its offset protocols. Right now they have livestock, protocols for livestock, ozone-depleting substances, methane capture and destruction, rice cultivation, urban forests, and U.S. forests, and CARB is just beginning rule development for a proposed international forest protocol for Acre, Brazil. And at the same time, the state has linked the its cap-and-trade market to Quebec's, and linkage to the Ontario program that's under development is planned, I think, in about the start of 2018. California also recently expanded its trading program to include transportation fuels. So I want Sean Carney to talk a little bit about what this expanded market means to the need for more offsets, or whether there are enough whether there will be offsets. And then I'll ask you some other questions about the California program later.
Sure, absolutely. So I think that a few exciting things are that we have California, we have Quebec, potentially Ontario, and potentially a few others. And what this allows us is to have the allowance for multiple points of failure. So we don't have to worry about, what happens if the California legislature does this. It's really, you have more parties, so you have diversification. We kind of have a portfolio of programs, portfolio of buyers that will, make the program as a whole more resilient to future risk and our existence in this ecosystem. So that's one thing. One thing that we spend a lot of time about, focusing on, is the supply. What are the supply projections? Are we undersupplied? Is there risk of oversupply? What is really coming down the pike? And I think that's something that we need to pay a lot of attention to, because there is a floor on allowances. There's a ceiling, price containment for allowances. There's a ceiling for offsets, which is effectively the price of an allowance, but there's no floor on an offset. Well, there is, but it's zero. So that's one of the focuses we would look at for offsets is are we really undersupplied? And yes, everybody's undersupplied until you're oversupplied.
Okay. What about the other question I have about the California offset program is that there have been a couple of enforcement decisions over the last year or two, I believe. And while the program was being developed, there was a lot of concern about how these decisions would be made. And I was wondering if you or anyone else has any position on how well CARB looked at those enforcement issues and are more comfortable with the way it played out.
Yeah. So forestry has not had an enforcement issue yet. We haven't had any issue with invalidation. There have been those with ODS and livestock. So I'll say, for one, I haven't been as involved in the minutia of what happens when one of these goes into effect.
Okay.
But for forestry, what we've been given, I think Rachel may have something to add. But I'll say for forestry, when one of the great things that has come out of all of this is that there's a lot more specificity around what triggers invalidation and what they look at when invalidation does happen. And those criteria have actually given us a lot of relief over a lot of the questions that we have been, had been kicking around for a few years.
Rachel?
Yeah, so there have been 2 invalidation investigations in the compliance program. I think the first one was a bit of a perfect storm, unfortunately. It being the first to happen in the market, the fact that it was at a facility where the vast majority of the ODS projects that were active in the system, where that material had been destroyed, And I don't know if ARB followed its rules to a T as far as how it technically handled the holding of the credits and taking the credits out of people's accounts. And that had a huge impact on the market. I mean, we saw that with, it was basically like putting a big wet blanket on top of everything. And we saw basically people just scared to do anything in any sector almost to a degree. We saw a drop off in project activity in the other sectors, obviously in the ODS sector, as that was the one large destruction facility. So I think ultimately what happened with that was a smaller impact because there weren't that many credits that were ultimately invalidated, and it did give some clarity to people about how it was going to be handled and a little bit about the time frame on which it would be handled. The second invalidation investigation had to do with some, let's see, I think the investigation looked at a single livestock project, and I forget if I think it was Ohio, and it actually had the potential to affect a number of other livestock projects, but the potential consequence was much smaller because it was a single project, a single reporting period, and good news is that it was sort of ruled in favor. I mean, there was no invalidation that ultimately resulted from that investigation. I think it still took a really long time to resolve, and I think there is still a lot of uncertainty about when ARB has enough information to actually start the 30 days in which they have to make the determination of whether the invalidation will move forward. So I think it would have been great if they had been reversed, if we had had the livestock investigation prior to the ODS investigation. I think it would have made the ODS investigation have less impact on the market. But I mean, these things are going to happen. I think to Sean's point, the fact that there are really only four elements that could cause an invalidation investigation. People are paying a lot of attention to those 4 elements and looking at the risk profile of projects and project types because of it.
Okay. So, Sean, Penrith. The Climate Trust announced a carbon investment fund earlier this year to finance U.S. offsets projects in exchange for a portion of the ownership of the carbon offsets generated. Can you tell us about that program and how unique it is, and what's the status of the first pilot investment?
Yeah. I would be remiss in saying that this is a unique fund. There have been funds. Many of them are train wrecks behind us, and so there's a lot to be learned. And prior to us launching our fund, we spent a year interviewing both current funds around the world and in America, and ones that have become shadows. So there was a lot of learning there. The unique thing of our carbon investment fund, first of all, we're an NGO, so we are now creating a different fund structure that we wholly own. And our unique value proposition is that we can be extremely patient with our capital. So we can wait for 10 years for any type of repayment. We're not trying to meet a 18 to 24-month return. So in that sense, we're fortunate. We also have our own internal resources at the Climate Trust in which we can ensure the pilot fund that we've launched. And so what that means is, in the event the market disappears tomorrow and there's a portfolio of projects that are delivering credits, the Climate Trust can exercise this put option agreement and step in and purchase those credits, thereby preserving the principal back to investors. This unique attribute of the Climate Trust being able to do that through the formation of our Oregon CO2 standard, which started in 1997 in Oregon, allows us to be very creative and has attracted a lot of attention from impact capital. Next week I'll be in Baltimore at the Mission Exchange Impact Capital Conference, and this theme of conservation finance into the climate sector is becoming huge. And what they're looking for is, show me a profit and loss, show me a pro forma, show me a project cycle, because there is money here, but we want to be able to see the track record. So in that sense, the patient capital, our ability to kind of guarantee the pilot fund, and this interface with very interested impact capital makes our fund a little unusual.
So the developers are going to come to you for this, for funding.
Yeah,
that the way?
the model is very simple. We take 10 years worth of carbon projected from a project. We provide up to 50% of the market value based on today's prices as an upfront investment to the project, which they can then use that capital to develop the project. Once the credits are commercialized over a 10-year period, we recover our upfront investment, and then the revenue from the resulting credits is shared evenly between the project developer and ourselves. So the advantage is they realize the value of carbon today through our upfront finance, and then as the prices increase, I've got my bullish carbon hat on, so as the prices increase and carbon matures and California expands and we have linkage, the project owner is getting a very substantial share in the resulting credits.
Are you looking for a specific location for these projects? Is it no?
It has to be within, for the pilot fund, it's within the borders of the US, and we focus on 3 sectors: grassland conservation, which is a voluntary sector, dairy digesters, and forestry, both types of forestry, avoided conversion and improved forest management.
And how much of initial investment is there? Is there initial dollar amount?
We've got, so we issued an RFP, we got about $28 million that is under consideration for the first $5.5 million of the $15 million. And out of the $5.5 million, it'll be 4 forestry, 3 digesters, and 1 grassland project. That's roughly the mix between the sectors.
Okay, Sean Newsum, it's your turn. The aviation industry is supporting the effort to develop a global market-based emissions reduction program, and it's largely propelled by the EU emissions cap on the industry. Could you tell us a little bit about the industry's interest in this and how it might play out?
Sure. So let me sort of start by step back a little bit and talk about the aviation industry in general a little. So we established commitments and goals for our CO2 emissions profile, or environmental footprint, as far back as 2008. And there were three elements to that. First was annual efficiency improvement of 1.5% up to 2020, carbon neutral growth from 2020 going forward, and a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050 relative to 2005 levels. What we're doing with this global carbon offset program is aligned to that middle goal, that carbon neutral growth goal from 2020 going forward. We've known for a while that even though we invest a tremendous amount of dollars into research and technology that results in more efficient aircraft, that even though we improve our efficiency on a fleet-wide basis by a little over 2% a year at this point since 2008, that wasn't going to be sufficient to have the emissions curve bend over to flatline on itself based on technology and operational improvements alone. So we had really a 4-pillar strategy: continue to invest in the technology for airplanes, continue to invest in operational efficiency of those airplanes, including new infrastructure for air traffic management. But 2 additional things that would be wholly new for aviation have been in work since that time as well. One is the development of sustainable aviation fuels. I'm from Boeing. We're working very hard on that to help propel the energy industry to develop sustainable fuels for aviation. And then the 4th pillar of that strategy was a global market-based measure. That work on the global market-based measure really took root in 2013 at the last ICAO assembly meeting, where there was a commitment to move forward on that. So ICAO stands for the International Civil Aviation Organization. That's an agency of the United Nations, and it's the governing body for international aviation around the world. All of the nations that participate in the aviation industry are represented and members of ICAO. The manufacturers and the airlines and others are observers to ICAO through their industry association. So I'm from Boeing, I'm a manufacturer. We have an organization we call ICAO that is our governing body. The airlines organize themselves under the International Air Transport Association, IATA. So the work in ICAO has been going on since 2013, again, to develop a global market-based measure, and evaluated different options, cap and trade, carbon offsets, pure carbon tax, and ultimately came to the conclusion collectively that a global carbon offset scheme, global carbon offset program, would provide the most effective, administratively simple, cost-effective approach to meeting our carbon neutral growth goal through this market mechanism. So it's been in work actively since 2013 with a key milestone pointed towards the upcoming ICAO assembly meeting this September in 2016. So a lot of work's been going into define the system design at a working level, and right now there's a great deal of political dialogue around what are the macro level parameters of this program that will be agreeable to all the member states around the world. You can imagine that the interests of the United States and China and Zimbabwe are all very different, and they need to come to some consensus on what the right program is that meets the needs of this very diverse set of stakeholders. When we agree to this, he says optimistically, it'll be the first global carbon offset program of its kind in the world, so there'll be some unique challenges there. But it's something that we as the aviation industry are openly supporting, that we've been behind this for quite a while. We think it's the best alternative to what we would expect to be a plethora or a patchwork quilt of regional or local schemes applied to aviation separately. So we'd rather have one global common system than dozens of others that we would have to, or at least that our operators would have to manage through.
And is the EU going to recognize this?
Well, the EU is participating. I, of course, can't speak for the European Union or the European Commission. They, as everybody knows, have the EU emissions trading scheme, and aviation is covered under that, though it's covered under a limited scope at the moment because they agreed to a so-called stop-the-clock provision back around 2013 or so when this last ICAO Assembly resolution was coming through, so that the current EU ETS only applies to intra-EU air traffic, and they've agreed to stop the clock on extraterritorial elements of that pending progress and agreement on the ICAO resolution.
Is there going to be a proposal released by September, or is it still unknown?
It's still in negotiation. They have put on the website, they've put into the public domain a draft proposal from the ICAO president. If you Google it, you can find it. If you would like help finding it, I'm happy to send you a pointer to it. But there is some framework that is now publicly viewable.
Okay, thank you. So Rachel, what is the Climate Action Reserve? What's the latest news on what you're doing in the offset world, and especially, maybe now that the Paris Agreement is signed, how are you going to respond to that, or if you can give us a take on all this?
Sure. Well, we, of course, will continue to focus a lot of efforts on our core program supporting the voluntary offset market and our role as an offset project registry under the California compliance offset market. Just sort of in our own day-to-day work, are seeing for the first time sort of a flip of the balance of power. In late 2015 was the first time that we had more active compliance projects in our program than we did active voluntary projects. So they're about even right now, but it just is a little bit of insight into where the market is headed. Perhaps there's not a precipitous decline in the number of voluntary projects, but we are seeing some projects reaching the end of their initial 10-year crediting period and move to completed as opposed to moving to renew for a second crediting period. So we'll continue a lot of efforts on that work. We expect the second half of this year to see about double the number of projects being registered and issued CRTs and ROCs than we have in the first half of this year, so it's going to be a busy fall and winter for us. But outside of sort of those core programs, some things that we're excited to be working on, I'd say are really trying to support and promote our other protocols that maybe don't get as much attention as they weren't picked up, to some degree, picked up by the compliance program. So, we have probably 16 odd protocols at this point, and while we were very honored to have those that did move over to the compliance program, we have a lot of other great protocols that we want to promote. So we were very pleased to receive funding, and you've probably heard about it already at some point during this conference, from the USDA NRCS program under the Conservation Innovation Grants to do some work to support our grassland protocol, helping to create a, sort of a handbook or manual to help project developers and actually do some stakeholder outreach and business development efforts for that project type, and we're working with the Climate Trust on that SIG, as well as to help fund a pilot project under the U.S. Grassland Protocol that was adopted by our board last year. We are doing an effort to support smaller forest owners to use our forest protocol, working to develop a standardized inventory tool to help lower the transaction costs of doing work under that project type. We adopted a nitrogen management protocol a number of years back and have yet to see a project come in under that protocol. So sort of going along the lines of the need for funds for some of these things to help get them off the ground. When ARB chose the protocols that it did, before they chose the protocols, people looked at all of the protocols as potentials for going into the compliance market. And now ARB has chosen a few winners to go to the compliance market, and it's left the other ones, people, it seems like they don't necessarily want to move forward with them if they don't get a clear signal that ARB might consider them. And so we find ourselves needing to do more to help bring those projects and project types to market than maybe we realized that we needed to from the first round, from our experience with the first round of protocols. So working on some efforts to revise the nitrogen management protocol, make it a little more user-friendly, and hopefully lower the transaction costs. And then as far as international efforts, I can't say that we'll be doing too much directly following on the heels of Paris, besides being happy about it for the time being and joining our sort of community in celebrating the moving forward of climate policy on an international scale. Our international efforts have really been focused in Mexico, and that's actually where all of our new protocol efforts have been focused the last year or so. We have been, for a number of years, been working on a Mexico forest protocol. There's a version 1.0 and 1.1 that are already available, but we've been working with a community down in Oaxaca for quite a while now to bring a pilot project to market. And there's a lot of talk about sector-based offsets here in California and how those might be brought into the fold. It's not sector-based offsets. The part that we're working on, it would fit into the nested approach. It's sort of the project level accounting piece of the nested approach. But we're doing, we're really working on the nuts and bolts of it, helping to get some verifiers trained up down in Mexico on the forest protocols, helping to actually work with the local community to develop what would be the version of the project implementation agreement that many of you are familiar with if you've done a forest protocol with us, sort of the legal agreement to ensure permanence. So really doing kind of nuts and bolts, boots on the ground work to make these project types work. We've also been working on a Mexico boiler efficiency protocol that we hope will serve the voluntary market in Mexico, but also there's provisions under their domestic carbon scheme to allow for offsets to sort of take the place of instead of paying a carbon tax, you could actually sort of surrender offsets in its stead. And so we've been working, doing a lot of effort down in Mexico to hopefully support that scheme and increase liquidity for their market. So.
Can I make a comment on
Sure.
So it's an unusual perspective because the voluntary sectors obviously look for a signal from ARB, and ARB, from my understanding and dialogue with them, are really looking at the voluntary sector as the laboratory to prove it out. And so we must never forget that the voluntary sector has a critical role in creating the on-ramp to ARB, bringing in new protocols, and can't just simply sit there and wait.
Yeah, I think we kind of took that for granted the first time around because it went so smoothly. But we're learning from that, and we're putting forth a lot more effort to help bring those projects to market and be the testing ground. And I always refer to us as a petri dish, to figure out what works.
So do you see the new opportunities with the Clean Power Plan, possibly with the domestic market in terms of offsets? Do you think this is?
I don't see any opportunity for offsets in the Clean Power Plan because of the way that the Clean Air Act is structured and the fact that offsets are outside of the fence line. So, unfortunately, no. It could be complementary. If the state wanted to go above and beyond what the Clean Power Plan requires and wanted to do a more robust and sort of wide-reaching, comprehensive approach to reducing emissions, they could add an offset component, but it wouldn't help them meet their Clean Power Plan goals or requirements.
All right. Any other comments before we invite people to the audience to comment, to ask questions? No? No. All right. So we get some questions from the room. I can't see. Questions on offsets, please? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Bill Dramho at the Washington Department of Ecology. I'm just curious, maybe for the panel to sort of talk about what sort of new generation protocols are coming, what new project types, or maybe thinking 5, 10 years down the road, what's maybe sort of in the pipeline or that's innovative. Thank you.
Yeah, I will honestly say that the reserve, we don't have a deep pipeline of project types that we are, just itching to get started on. And I think that might be a little bit because funding has dried up a bit for developing new protocols. I mean, that was, 10 years ago, we were able to get large grants to fund the development of a number of different project types and protocols, but I think because of, specifically for the case here in California, because of the signals that ARB has sent regarding their desire to develop the protocols themselves and their lack of ability to share with us the project types that they're interested in, it makes it very difficult for us to sort of do that groundwork and do the sort of early stage development of the methodology in the same way. And I will say the places where we have seen, we personally have had a focus in recent history is sort of in the agriculture, biosequestration arena, and those are, because of the standardized approach that we take for developing protocols and methodologies, those are we really feel ourselves really butting against the bleeding edge of what the science can tell us with the kind of level of certainty that's required for the offset market. And so we've had some elegant solutions. Max Dubison, sitting right next to you, did a great job with our grassland protocol and really pushing the envelope on streamlining that. And even though it is a bio-based protocol, we were able to come up with some really unique and streamlined ways to make the transaction costs low on that. But the uncertainty levels with sort of the biogeochemistry and the you get into the bio-based offsets, it's difficult. It's difficult to do. So we need the scientists to keep working out there to help us help them. So
I'll just add that we have a lot of people come to the Climate Trust for funding and grassland specifically because of the support from the NRCS, USDA, SIG that we worked on a grasslands project in the Dakotas, and the credits were then sold to Chevrolet, created an incredible focus on the grassland sector, so much so that we've actually integrated it into our investment portfolio. So those types of supports are what's leading these new market sectors. The other one, we transacted the one and only nitrogen reduction credit in the United States of America. It was a 50-page contract for one credit. And then, the biochar, we were heavily involved with many stakeholders to try and advance that, and unfortunately it died in the vine, but that's one. And then wetlands is another huge one. But I think until we're able to connect the dots between emerging sectors and the infrastructure, both policy and finance and stakeholder, to support it so it can migrate through the pilot stage, through to market traction in the voluntary sector, through to eventual consideration by ARB and others, it's never going to get there. And we worked with, I know Debbie's in the room somewhere, but CAG, the Coalition of Agricultural Greenhouse Gas, they've been leading an effort to, which we joined, to have the Council of Environmental Quality in DC change their greenhouse gas guidelines to allow for federal agencies to use, they're allowed to use RECs as part of their compliance under the executive order, but offsets have been prohibited because the standards were too fuzzy and there wasn't really permanence and so on. And so we have collectively argued that this industry in this building is very advanced, heavily peer-reviewed, and it is a standing industry that they can count on. And so the idea is that the CEQ will amend those guidelines and allow for the use of offsets from voluntary sectors. What that will do is blow the doors off these emerging sectors, because now, depending on the quota they allow, we can bring wetland credits, we can bring nitrogen reduction, and that kind of release mechanism that we need, because obviously it's moving too slowly.
But just because we could, does that mean that we should?
If you look at the sequestration potential, if you look at those sectors, that's the way we look at it in terms of prioritization.
But this market is only so big. This isn't an infinite amount of money here to work with. I mean, the market in California right now can only take 200 million credits. And the protocols that we have are doing a pretty good job of creating a lot of those credits. And I think when you look at environmental markets and just the history of environmental markets is just a series of shifting events where we tend to repeat things that we've already seen. So if you look at rules of environmental markets, rule number one is that environmental commodities always crash. They ultimately go to zero. Look at the CCX, look at EU, look at New Zealand, look at a number of environmental programs in the world. That's a trend that happens. And I think that California's learned a lot of lessons, and they put a floor price on the allowances for this reason. But that's the second point, is that if there's a floor and a ceiling in a program, these programs are not created by a natural market. There's no natural supply and demand. It's bureaucrats that create the market. In which case, if you have a floor and a ceiling, the price is always at the floor or always at the ceiling, which I think we see this in allowances right now. Like I said, for offsets, the ceiling is the allowance price, the floor is zero. So the more offsets that are put out there, the more supply you get, the closer to this 200 million you get, and you run the risk of oversupply.
Well, I think the difference is, I think it's a good point. The point of my comment around the CEQ thing is to actually open up an additional market that is not necessarily reliant on the compliance market in California, because through our estimates, if they pass this amendment on the greenhouse gas guidelines, that would release a 15% more voluntary market demand into the United States market that is not reliant on a floor or a price or a compliance market. That's one. And two, you're right, except for the fact that maybe I'm just naive, and I'm naively ambitious, that this market won't just be contained to the current markets, and that we will have ultimately a fungible, we must have a fungible and a global market. And so the ability to release the process of bringing emerging sectors into the fold is really important. And we can't simply wait for a compliance signal to say, I'm picking you, develop your sector, and come to the party.
Another question?
Yes, John Scheidler from NSF International. This is a question for Mr. Newsum. Do you have any estimates on the amount of demand for aviation offset credits that might be generated by ICAO approving the market-based mechanism?
I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there have been estimates that have been done. And there's been studies of the available supply of offsets presently and the expected demand, and believe that there is a reasonable balance there, at least in the foreseeable future. I can get you the estimates offline. I just don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Harold Pastano with PG&E, and I'm going to post something that might be a little bit of crazy talk, but what are the prospects of increasing the 8% threshold for offset credits so that we might be able to promote some more activity here?
I think that you're dealing with a very sensitive space. And I think that when, we've settled on this equilibrium of 8%. Every time you open something up in this market, it tends to get out of control. So even the debate about the 8% would probably not end in anyone being happy about the opportunity. And then when you open things like that up, people inevitably go and try to attack other pieces of the program. So I think that 8% is kind of like a happy balance for the time being. I do worry about things like, sector-based red. What if it does come in? It's limited to 4%, but we're probably going to hit over 4% with the credits we already have. So if there is a floodgate for sector-based red and it comes in, it takes up the entire 4%, where does that leave us? In which case, one of the ideas I've heard bandied about is, what if you make the sector-based red in addition to the 8% instead of being part of the 8%? Because I think that the 8% is great for what we have, but we're not going to be able to add any more protocols, any more, countries, any more huge sources of supply without, unbalancing what we've achieved so far. And that's one of the few things, I guess, when you talk about balancing supply and demand, yeah, these markets have been created by people that aren't perfect, but that 8% number has actually functioned pretty well so far.
Other questions?
Hi, Ted Atwood, TrackRef. Well, I was part of the CCX failure. I lost a lot of credits. Not proud of it, but it's part of the experience process. And I noticed that the trepidation about growing the carbon offset market, here's the question, is that part of a shrinking space that we're trying to manage? Or is it truly about not wanting to have more offsets to drive the price down?
Maybe you could just clarify the question.
So it seems we're only managing a certain percent of the overall carbon that we're emitting. So as we grow what comes first? Do we grow offsets and then increase the coverage, or do we grow the coverage and then bring in the offsets?
The latter.
Why?
Because you have to balance the assuming you're talking about a cap and trade, you have to balance the cap and the declining cap, and then the pro rata share of offsets. So you want to start with what the covered sectors are and the scope of those before you can address the offsets.
Is that really true? I mean, we're talking, just for instance, in the ODS space, we had one project that failed, but otherwise there's tens of millions of pounds of refrigerant. There's actually 400 million pounds of refrigerant vented a year. That's vented. If we were to do more to increase the capture rate of that material, it would flood the market based on your perspective, but it would save the carbon emissions from the refrigerant side. So what's the fear there? Is it the lower price, the oversupply?
It's not a matter of a lower price, it's a matter of a zero price, in which case nothing's achieved.
But then won't the market balance itself out by not doing that again?
So I think that one thing is that there is no invisible hand in this market. There is a hand, and it's visible, and it belongs to the government. And they can kind of do whatever they want here, but I think that what they want to promote is an incentive for people to do these projects. And
yeah, but we've had I don't want to interrupt you, but we've had a 20-year incentive on recovery. It's actually a requirement. We've vented 6.8 billion pounds of refrigerant since the time we started these regulations. So as these offset projects, like the HFC one that just came out from ACR, or the one that EOS developed for the advanced refrigeration process, those type of offset programs offer a tremendous amount of liquidity in the market. Yes, they'll balance out, they'll probably drive some parts of the pricing down, but at the same time, doesn't that give us the ability to have more coverage over the carbon that we're actually managing?
So, understand exactly what the question is.
Well, the question is, we're not managing all of the carbon right now. We're only measuring certain aspects of it, but we're also ignoring this really large pool of offset potentials.
Is this just for California?
Yeah, so I guess I mean, there are capped sectors and uncapped sectors, and the offsets come from the uncapped sectors. And I guess there are two ways to deal with the uncapped sectors, is either increase the scope of the coverage of the capped sectors, or you increase the ability of the uncapped sectors to participate. And I take your point. I guess there's only just so much space to put the uncapped sectors into the capped sectors until you have 100% coverage, or you have 99% coverage. But I mean, think of forestry. I don't think a command and control or forestry as a capped sector is anything that would likely ever happen. And I think you worry about what would happen if in California about industries leaving when they increase the prices. Well, what if they cap the sector of forestry? I mean, Brazil is already a competitive sector for paper and pulp for the United States. So what happens then? So I think that there's a limit to how many sectors that you can even cap.
Yeah, but I'm just being specific to this one, because if we keep that cap in place and we say, okay, let's bring in more carbon to manage before we bring in more offsets, then we're always going to keep on a cap, or we're always going to be at the high end of that potential market. And if we open it up, if we open up what we're covering, there are plenty of offsets to offset the extra coverage that we've got, and it does give the markets better control over the pricing. And over the last period of time, I've watched these offset discussions largely center around what can we limit. But won't the market provide enough limit in and of itself through the value?
Well, just for perspective, as of 12/31 last year, only 4.1% of the 8% was actually used in the offset market. And you can look at that in two different ways, and I've heard it argued strenuously in two different ways. One is there's not enough supply. The other is there's not enough demand. And so I think I'm getting what you're saying, although I don't think, clearly we're not at the 8% limit already. So we need additional credits. If the cost containment attribute of offsets is truly recognized, as the spread increases between allowances and offsets, we will move closer and closer to the 8%. Right now, we're not there. Some of the covered entities, that many of them are in this room, look at offsets and just go, you know what, it's brain trauma. I'm not going to go through a contracting process. Other people see it as an opportunity. And so it's kind of this balance between the supply and the contracting appetite from the covered entities. So I don't think we're at that point yet, if I'm getting your point.
Well, I guess the major overall question, I don't want to occupy all this, so I appreciate you guys answering it, is that half of the problem is that people who control these refrigerants don't know what an offset looks like.
Right.
You've got major corporations that would never intentionally emit refrigerant, but you've got contractors and OEM suppliers who don't really understand what an offset looks like, and we don't really make it very easy. And that's not intentional. But until we standardize it, it's very hard for them to see it. The market will be flooded the minute people understand how these carbon projects work. But if you look at a carbon offset, the way the aggregation takes place, it can be 2-3 years before you build up enough value for destruction, and then you get everything done the right way, and then you have to have the legacy information. And most of that doesn't exist. And what I'm saying is, if we did more to standardize those processes, couldn't we then open this offset market up significantly and then grow the coverage?
Yeah, so I see one point that you're making, which is that these are not easy to do, and that definitely limits supply on even just the protocols that we have. And we've seen this with forestry. I mean, it used to be that a project producing 200,000 tons was a good project. Now it has to be at least 500,000 tons to work. So the cap, the size of the people that can participate is just going up and up and up. The complexity is going up and up and up. There's less money going to landowners because there's so many intermediaries that are required. You have to have somebody take on the invalidation. You have to have somebody actually develop the project. It's limiting what we can do because they've made it so complex. Now that being said, I mean, I don't think that ARB sees their job as making it easy to get offsets into the program. They see their job as protecting the program from those who want to destroy it. And the only way to do that is that, they have to be fierce government bureaucrats and say, we are going to protect this program no matter what, which means just adding layer upon layer upon layer of rigor until it drives us all insane. But they're doing it for a reason, I guess, which is to make it, something that can't be taken down. And I think they've done a really good job of that because a lot of people have tried. This isn't Little League. There are no trophies for participation. They this is a kind of a, it's a big program. It's not a game, I guess. It's a, everybody here is playing for keeps. The people that are trying to get rid of the program are spending a lot of money on it. They have this huge focus. ARB, on the other hand, is doing everything they can to protect it. And if the cost of that rigor, if the cost of that protection of the program is this for right now, I'm all for it.
So that's my point. We have two ceilings in place. We have the process ceiling, and then we have the cap on the ability.
You are right about the process ceiling. It is definitely, there's a, small landowners can't get into this program, which California would be, they would, if small landowners in California could participate in this program, it'd be much better for the state because they sell the offsets, they pay taxes on their income, inside of the state. But they've made it even impossible for small landowners in the state of California to participate in this program. And, hopefully over time that changes, but.
Well, I appreciate your feedback, but I think it's an evolving topic that as yet we haven't spent as much time talking about that, how to release the cap on that process more so than releasing the cap on the market. Is that fair? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Keith Williams of the Malpas Company. I have a question for Rachel. Rachel, what process do you guys utilize when you look at protocols that perhaps are thinly participated in, and you look at them, and can you describe a process that you're going through to perhaps improve some aspect of that protocol that would bring more participation? And I'm specifically interested in reforestation, avoided conversion. I see very little participation in those protocols, and I'm thinking, I'd like to jump in there, but it's got to be a little more friendly.
Sure. Well, I welcome you to have a discussion with our Director of Forestry, John Nickerson, if you have any specific ideas on what we could do to improve those protocols. I mean, I'll say that the way that we develop protocols, it takes a lot of money to even get the protocol developed initially. So we have this multi-stakeholder work group, which thankfully they all volunteer their time and we don't have to pay them. But it's usually years of work and usually some technical contractor hired to help with some of the number crunching. And so it's no small feat to get the first version of the protocol out the door. And as I said, I think we had luck. I think that our goal was always to create regulatory quality protocols, and I think that we succeeded in doing that enough so that California could take those first batch of protocols and bring them into the program, and that only happened once, right? And that's actually, those are two project types that did happen for, so you probably should have a conversation with John Nickerson, but I think that what we're doing now, applying for the SIG grants when we never have before, right? I mean, this 2015 was the first time that the Reserve had ever attempted to get one of those conservation innovation grants. I think we thought before it was a little bit of a conflict of an interest for us to help sort of pilot a project under our own protocol. What if it wasn't successful? Like how would this all work out? But we're seeing the need to help support some of these protocols and project types more. So all I can say is that we are open to listening to ideas. We are open to finding creative ways to fund efforts to further the protocols that we haven't seen much effort on, but it's definitely new ground for us as well. It's not something that we've developed a great system for the way that we have for protocol development.
Any other questions? No more? One more?
Hi, I'm Mike Szabo from Carbon Pulse. I have a question, but just in relation to the offset demand from ICAO, we've reported on an analyst estimate. I forget who it's from, but they estimate it's 30 million tons in 2020, rising to 300 million tons by 2030. So I think that might be from Point Carbon or one of the analysts. But my question's for the panel. So I'm based in Europe, and I cover mainly the European market and the CDM. And One thing that strikes me about the market here, especially with offsets, is that there doesn't seem to be a kind of a central regulatory presence for the offset market, in that California can go off and do what they like with offsets, and they can open the market up to Latin America, and then Ontario can develop certain protocols in Quebec and et cetera. But do you foresee the need of some kind of central body there to kind of control aspects of quality or quantity? Because in the EU ETS, that was a major issue. We've had issues with quantity of CERs, and we've had issues of NDRUs and issues of quality with HFC, N2O, and then credits being approved unilaterally in Ukraine and Russia. So I'd be interested in hearing your views on that.
I'd like to say that yes, I do think it would be useful to have a coordinating body. However, having been a part of a number of discussions in states across this country, and I don't mean to say it in a denigrating way, but most states, and the state I live in Oregon, we are very interested in ensuring that the offset types are pertinent to our state, even though we recognize the need and scale of economies and the productive use of a homogeneous market that is controlled, that the standards actually mesh together. And I think that's the delicate tension. Policymakers in states want to be able to respond to their constituents and don't want to have a central coordinating body tell them that this protocol is good and that one's not, because the topography and geography is vastly different. But coming from a fund perspective, I would love it.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the WCI, let's focus on just that. And you have, Quebec and Ontario and California, and there is a principle built within that agreement that says that, really the highest environmental standard is adopted universally by all. So for one, instance is that in the forestry protocol, there's a limit on even age management of 40 acres in California. That principle should mean that when Ontario and Quebec, adopt their practices, they also include a 40-acre cap on even age management. Now, what happens if that's challenged, I don't know, but in theory, there is this kind of understanding between the different programs that maintains this, the environmental integrity of each individual protocol. So even though they can't exactly do whatever they want, there is kind of a guideline, an understanding between them all of how to roll these things out. But your point's taken, but there is a little there is a little bit of consistency between them.
And so within the aviation program that's being developed, those numbers sound reasonable. I'm just doing the math in my head about what the emissions growth rate is, so okay, thanks. And in terms of the idea of environmental integrity across programs, part of what's being developed under the aviation program in ICAO is a set of criteria for those emission units. There wouldn't necessarily be a central governing body to explicitly oversee that, though that's still being discussed. But there would be a common set of criteria that all of the participants in the aviation program would have to adhere to. And so there would be some criteria that would keep out bad to some yet to be agreed definition offset programs, and some minimum criteria for what would be allowed in to participate. The intent is to do the participation and approval at the program level, not at an individual project. There wouldn't be an ICAO-specific offset program. It would look to existing programs that are already out there in the world or might be developed in the future.
I just want to add one thing, that coming out of the Paris Agreement, the carbon pricing coalition, or whatever they were called, that they announced. I mean, the question really isn't should there be offset coordination in North America or between Canada and America. It's going to be painfully obvious that that's required if you look at 190 countries submitting their INDCs, and 88 of them are calling for a pricing mechanism of some sort to meet their targets. There needs to be coordination. If they're adopting some degree of offset flexibility, what does that look like? And so to me, ultimately, there's going to have to be coordination. Otherwise, it'll be a mess.
Okay, any other question?
Yeah, hi. Adam Chambers from USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service. My question's for Sean from Boeing, and it's a little bit of a loaded question, so I'll warn you in advance. So how does Boeing treat the biofuels? You mentioned the drop-in biofuels, and do you treat them as carbon neutral? And then there's kind of, I'm going to give the whole load of the question here. Do you envision kind of a RIN market or something like that having to come alongside the drop-in biofuels market to kind of keep track of the carbon neutrality or non-neutrality of the biofuels going into the aviation sector?
Yeah, there's a lot to chew on in there. It's a sort of knock them down one at a time. So there's a policy decision that can go in, not necessarily a technical decision, but a policy decision that can go in that some have made, including in the EU ETS, where biofuels of any type are treated as 100% emission reduction. That's not a technical judgment. That's essentially a built-in incentive mechanism for policy purposes to encourage the increased usage. From a Boeing standpoint, we are following strong sustainability principles in the biofuels that we are developing, that we are pushing the aviation industry to develop, structured around the roundtable on sustainable biomaterials criteria for sustainability and using them as the gold standard, if you will, for what would qualify. And so from that standpoint, we look at biofuels that typically have an emission reduction potential of 50 to 80% on a life cycle basis. Within the global MBM framework that we're developing, the emissions reductions, the life cycle emissions reductions that would be associated with the use of sustainable fuels or biofuels would be accounted for as a emission reduction on the operator's emissions. So it would be, there would be a, similar to what's done under California LCFS, there would be a sort of a standard methodology by which you would calculate the emission reduction of a given amount of fuel. There would be bookkeeping of how much fuel is utilized, and that credit would go, not credit in the offset sense, but credit in the actual reported emissions for the operator sense would go into their bookkeeping. So it would be a technically based net reduction of the emissions, not a policy-based decision. You could, hypothetically, layer on top of that some policy decision to encourage it, but it would be something separate and something different, and it probably wouldn't be part of the global MBM framework itself. Trying to think if there's other things laced in there. So would there be a RINs type program? I think it would be indirect, if as long as you're doing it as a reduction in the airline's net reported emissions. They're in effect reducing their offset obligation through doing that, and so they would be getting the financial incentive through the alternative of purchasing the offset credits if they didn't use the alternative fuels. And so it would be kind of like a RIN, but not really like a RIN. Yeah. Did I get all of the bits of that question? Yeah. Okay.
We have any other comments or questions?
So just wondering, with the uncertainty that I've kind of heard at the conference here about the compliance program beyond 2020, what do you think beyond 2020 the future is for offsets in such a program?
Well, since we're committing a tremendous amount of money in the fund, we're very positive that there'll be a post-2020 market.
I mean, we're offset developers for both the voluntary market and compliance market, so yeah, we feel the same way. But it's diminished a bit this week, unfortunately, after hearing all the memories. So.
Stay strong.
So you're confident that the program will be continued?
I am.
Yeah.
It's just a gut feeling, but I am as well. We have plenty of work until 2020, but I mean, I think that there's been a lot of careful thought and consideration that went into this program. There has been a lot of infrastructure, maybe not, capital investment infrastructure, but infrastructure built around it. I think that the auction revenue has made some people want to keep that auction revenue around. So I think that it would be hard to disassemble it at this point.
What about the pending legal case about the auction? Is anyone nervous about that, outcome of that case?
I think that, I think everyone should be nervous about it. If you'd asked that question to us anyway 6 or 7 months ago, we would have said, no, we're not at all. It's prevailed. However, we saw the calamity of the Clean Power Plan being stayed, and so that sent a nervous shock through the industry, and so now anything's possible, as we can see with the presidential elections. So, but I do think that, and you've all heard this before, but the manner in which the 7 questions have been issued for response from stakeholders is very particular, it's very detailed, and it serves to indicate that they are going to great lengths to figure out that even if they do rule that it's an invalid tax, that they have some sort of creative way of maintaining the program. So I don't think, again, I'm bullish, but I think that they'll prevail. The other thing is, as you talk about the red credits, and we've got China and America signing the Paris Agreement, and we're talking about international linkages, MOU with Mexico, the political inertia is very strong, and so while ARB has to balance the technical provisions and the legality, there's also this political snowball that is accelerating, thankfully, but it also has a very positive effect on making sure that there is a post-2020, because they can hardly be talking about linking to red projects around the world, and then PS, post-2020, we're gone.
Yeah, I think that it's not a question of whether this lawsuit prevails or not. It's what impact it has while they're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
And if you all remember, the referendum, what that year was kind of a lost year in the carbon market. The Supreme Court case went all the way to California Supreme Court to strike down this program to begin with. That was another lost year for this program. My hope is that the next year is not going to be a lost year or a killer momentum, or prevents the adoption of other states of joining WCI because of just the uncertainty. So does it prevail? Probably not. But what's that going to do to us in the meantime while we wait and see?
Okay. Any other questions? One more. Great.
Hi, I have a question for the Sean in the middle. So it seems that the International Civil Aviation Organization is moving faster than the UNFCCC, possibly, which of course is not a great feat, but I'm wondering to what extent kind of the decisions that you're making about, what offset programs may be in or out, or even, what project types might be on this good or bad list, how much the two processes are kind of watching each other and aligned, and if the International Civil Aviation Organization moves first, kind of what effect do you think that might have on the development of, version 2.0 of the clean development mechanism, yet to be determined what that's going to be called. But
ICAO is moving remarkably fast by ICAO standards, and probably even faster by UNFCCC standards. I can't think of something that has been worked from scratch that has made so much progress. So I said since 2013, that's when they had the Assembly resolution. The real work didn't really start until the beginning of 2014. So it's really been 2 years of very rapid negotiation, very rapid development, because they really need to reach an agreement by this year in order to hit on a timeline that allows you to implement it into that 2020 carbon neutral growth milestone. So thank you for noticing that things are moving fast. In terms of what the potential implications are for CDM 2.0 and really any other program or protocol that might be developed, your guess is as good as mine. In essence, ICAO is developing its criteria for what that would be applied to existing programs. It isn't necessarily selecting programs explicitly as part of the negotiation framework. But obviously, anybody who's involved in those negotiations knows what programs are out there, right? And while they may not be explicitly saying, I want this program in, I want this program out, certainly when they're talking about their positions and what the criteria are, they've got that kind of framework in mind. I think, to the extent that we're going to be creating a certain amount of demand for offsets, that will definitely create the market for programs as needed. And hopefully they'll be available.
Can I just ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah.
Just interested to get your reaction to there was a story this week about part of the proposal involving a multiplier factor for red credits, so that if airlines wanted to use red, they would need to use two credits for each ton. So I'm just interested to hear what if that's supported by you or the industry.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that question, in part because I don't know the answer. It sounds like something that is probably under negotiation, and how it got into the press, I don't know. So generally speaking, ICAO negotiation happened under confidentiality agreements. There's been certain elements that have been made public as part of the global outreach. That ICAO convened a session of global aviation dialogues last year and another session this year. And that's what spurred the publication of the draft resolution. And really anything beyond that, such as what you're suggesting there, is probably a reflection of internal dialogues.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time. Any last comments from any of you? Any predictions? No?
Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you all for staying.